War of Nerds, yeah! Dun 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 dun. Funky fantasy, dun dun dun. The bowl, dun dun dun. Stratus arrows, dun 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 dun. It's the War of Nerds. Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. Hope you're having a fantastic night. This is your bearded nerdy hosts back once again with another episode of the War of Nerds. And tonight it's special guest edition. So we're going to get started. We're talking about the Wheel of Time tonight, as well as a little bit of D&D sprinkled in and out. But yeah, so if you would like to take the floor and talk about all the good stuff, take it away.
Oh, you want, okay. So I watched you guys' first podcast, and y'all talked a little bit about the things that got you into literature. I was not a great reader when I was very young. And like I liked fantasy. I enjoyed things like primarily the Young Jedi Chronicles that they had when I was in like 6th or 7th grade. So I liked a little bit of Star Wars, but there wasn't a ton of Star Wars content that I was like well read enough to be able to understand. And it took me a long time to get into, really reading in particular. So Wheel of Time actually was the thing that happened with, and it sort of leads into the topic of how I turned into a nerd in the first place. My brother was a huge influence. My big brother, he ever since we were children, he was writing games, like making stuff. He made up his own games. After he played Dungeons and Dragons, he wanted to try out his own rules and characterizations and things like that. Spoiler alert, he did actually end up doing something with that. Unlike some people, he actually went on and did that. My brother actually wrote for Wizards of the Coast for a while. He did some Dungeons and Dragons. And Star Wars. Actually, he got his start in doing the Star Wars RPG. But basically, my dad was like, "Hey, your school doesn't have a required reading list. You still have to read a summer book every summer." And my brother was like, "Okay, well, this school does these book lists, and The Wheel of Time was on that book list." It was huge, and so like it naturally satisfied my dad's you have to read a huge book every summer, but also it was something that was like relatively interesting to me as a young man. And so like I went from making terrible grades in English, in reading comprehension and stuff like that, to suddenly I was the best in my class. And it was just the insane vocabulary and everything that was used in there. And that actually leads me into one of the things that I think Jordan does the best, and also the worst. Because I love Robert Jordan. Robert Jordan does a fantastic job in The Wheel of Time. He expounds on everything that he's talking about. He's very detailed. He's painstakingly detailed. Like it's really great when you're wanting to set things up, when you're wanting to world build. He does tend to go on a little bit long about certain things. Sometimes it suits a perfect purpose. In fact, there are a few times in the story that he masterfully uses how his narration drones on, and like he'll slip these spy figures that he's got in, and he uses the mundanity of that. Like as you're scanning over this, he's talking about this description, and this guy, the buttons are this color with these things, and the collar, and the guy with the knife behind him in the background, and then and then there's the sword hilt with all the jewels, and you're like, wait, what? And you go back a page, and you're like, there was a guy there, and like you just scan over it because it does that mundanity. So he does a really great job with even using that description to sort of subvert your opinions. I loved The Wheel of Time. It was my intro to like real high fantasy. It holds a special place to me in my heart because it was one of the first ones that I really got engaged with. I did like some R.A. Salvatore. I read a whole lot of D&D books and stuff like that, but that was before I got into other stuff when I was in college. I got introduced to Martin, and I got introduced after to Rothfuss, who AJ will tell you is my favorite author, even though he's never going to finish the work that I'm very, very attached to.
Yeah.
For a while there, that was exactly what my fear was with Robert Jordan, was that he was never going to finish his work. He took a long time, and then he contracted a very dangerous and rare disease, and essentially the clock was ticking. And so everybody was like, he is nowhere near finished with his story. We're never going to get it? And he was like, if I die, I'm going to hand it off to somebody else. And everybody was really skeptical about that, and he handed it to Brandon Sanderson. And I like Brandon Sanderson. I won't say everything he touches is gold by any stretch of the imagination. I know he has a lot of detractors by the fact that he just churns out tons and tons of books. I think that's a very admirable thing, because when my brother got his advice starting, it was basically just keep writing, if you want to keep writing. I think a lot of people see the huge size of the books that Martin and Jordan and all of them write, and they get intimidated. But Sanderson churned out those 3 from the notes in a very short amount of time, and he did a really great job of sealing the deal.
I do want to touch on that really quick.
Yeah,
that's almost, you brought up Rothfuss and how his 2 books took the world by storm. They haven't, the story is not complete. He's put out a couple of short stories, some novellas to expand on the world, but it's almost become like a I don't want to say a cliche, but like a fun, and it's not really funny, but it's almost like, okay, the next big fantasy author, are they going to finish the series? How long is this series going to be? Because you got Martin, and now Robert Jordan's case is not the same as Martin and Rothfuss. I feel
no,
he would have finished the series.
well, I mean, it I don't know. It might be in Martin's case. Martin seems to be in decent health as far as we know, but he's no spring chicken, right? Like Rothfuss is quite a bit younger than him, so the chances of him finishing just one more book, and that's the thing, is like, it kind of seems like he's capable of doing that one more book in the amount of time than, say, Martin, who's apparently got 2 or 3 more books. And this came from Martin wanting originally to just do a trilogy, right? Well, Rothfuss seems to have, at least in terms of the primary narrative, kept that to 1 book. I remember reading somewhere that originally Jordan intended for his to be a lot shorter, and I think that's the biggest legitimate criticism. I hope one of y'all will swoop in and give me some more feedback on this, because I am going to defend how good he is, but it's hard to appreciate Jordan's work and not see the flaws in it. And some of those flaws, he did have trouble with writing women. His women were very one-dimensional, as opposed to somebody like Martin or Rothfuss, who do a really, really good job. I think actually Brandon Sanderson does a really good job with writing female characters. In like,
Vin is one of the
navigating all of the difficulties with that.
Powerful female characters. She starts out as any male character would in a fantasy story, as a meek peasant, and then grows into this phenomenal superhero-esque character by the end of the series.
Yeah. And I was going to say, I'm glad you did that one, because to be honest with you, Mistborn is the one of his work that I am the most familiar with, and I love Mistborn. He did a really great job. You can really see how picking up with Jordan's work, some of Jordan's female characters are really fleshed out and they're pretty good. Some of them are not. But towards the very end, he picks up a handful of side characters and does something with them. And he turns two of those side characters into my two favorite side characters in the span of 3 books, right? There's all this time to develop all of these other characters and do a good job with it. And he takes it and hammers home, okay, here's a character with like a clear deficit. His whole thing is he can't do X, but he does this one niche really well, and here's all the creative ways he uses it. And then he kind of gets paired, actually. They're two interesting characters. He gets paired with another character that she's got like a real grudge against the darkness, right? So like she has personal stakes because her family was murdered by dark friends. And so like you get this different perspective that we got like a tiny chapter where it's like this guy's mentioned, or Jordan says something about her where she's working in the tower and what she's trying to accomplish. But he expands on those characters and just fleshes them out into something so much better. So Jordan does a great job with.
I was just going to say, before you finish that, how, and you may have already touched on it a little bit, but how does, if you picked up the book, obviously you wouldn't want to, but where Brandon Sanderson begins, how different is the storytelling, or can you feel, is there enough distinction where you're like, I'm not reading Robert Jordan anymore? Or is it, okay,
absolutely.
there is?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And I would say, so this is the thing that at that point becomes a refreshment. Jordan is a master of slow rolling things. He kind of almost has a difficult time not doing that. Towards the end, there are, or I should say, towards like the late middle, since there's 14 books in the series. Yeah. Right after book 9, there's a section right before the final 3 books that they probably could have been condensed into one, right? 10, 11, and 12, not that much happens. To the point, I'm sorry, I'm knocking my thing all over the place. To the point that by the time you get to those, so much has been built up that like essentially Sanderson gets, it's like he set up this whole set of dominoes, this crazy world, and Sanderson gets to be the one that flicks the domino and start that fall. So like it could be that all the pieces were there and he was just ready to do it, and it could be that he decided, look, we've got to kick this pace up really, really badly. He doesn't, it takes 3 books to resolve pretty much everything, but I don't feel like any of those that's the thing, is it would have been so easy for so many of those resolutions to be dissatisfying. They would have been so easy to bobble and mess up. And he does such a great job of taking those pieces and moving with them. And I'm very impressed just from a writing standpoint, because I can't imagine what it would be like to take someone else's work, their characters and things like that, and to he fundamentally understands all of the characters. There's no character that I'm like, well, that's the thing. When you say there's the distinct difference, it's the story. It's not the characters, and that's what's so good about it, is that all the pieces begin falling, like I say, but you never say, wow, this guy is just a completely different character, nothing that Jordan wrote. It's entirely Sanderson's work. That never happens. I never feel like you lose the plot with the characters who are already well established. You do get some refreshing new perspectives, which again is kind of surprising towards the end of a 14-book series, but there you have it.
See, that's kind of where I wanted that. That's great to know that you can still pick up the book and the characters have not changed, even if the story style has altered a little bit.
Yeah.
So I got a quick question.
Sure.
Well, probably not a quick question. It's going to take some elaboration, but Alfred's familiar with the series. I know Nathan wants to get into it. Me, I have zero knowledge of the series whatsoever, other than its popularity what would you describe as, without going into spoilers or anything like that, what is Wheel of Time, and kind of what is the gist of it for anybody who's coming to this podcast without any knowledge of it?
Okay. Yeah, I guess I did kind of yammer on without talking about that. So
I mean, a lot of topics we do go into, like Star Wars, Lord of the Rings, people know, and we give no baseline because there's an assumption. But just coming from the oddball out, actually, I'm kind of curious.
Well, and to be frank with you, like you mentioned the show, like they follow the same vague outline, but the show is so drastically different. There's very few times where I would. So I come from a different background. I really like to watch movies or shows before I read the books because I always find the books or shows to be an incredible disappointment. By comparison to the written word, it's usually a much better story with a few exceptions, sometimes pacing and things, sometimes they make good changes. I would say Wheel of Time as a show is so drastically different from the books that I would recommend the books first. So I guess that's not really that much of a change for you guys, but to give you the gist of it, essentially, the Wheel of Time follows the premise that the universe is actually governed by, shockingly, a Wheel of Time. Every like age that you live in is a series of events that is taking people's lives that are like threads weaving a tapestry, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so in the story begins at the like the later part of the Third Age. It tells a story that dips back into what's called the Age of Legends. In fact, the prologue actually gives you kind of the finale in this like crazy, what's going on moment, where you're essentially seeing the aftermath of an apocalypse, right? Just right out the gate, it's like dude stepping over bodies, and he's completely insane, talking to a person that's not there while a guy is taunting him, and he's upset that he's too insane to do it. So the other aspect of Wheel of Time, the thing that really makes it fantastical, apart from like the cyclical nature and how time repeats itself and stuff like that, is that the wheel is driven by a power called the True Source. And it is a power that men and women divide equally. Each of them has a piece of power, and it kind of looks like the yin and yang symbol, and the idea is that them pushing and pulling against one another are what turns the wheel. But there are people in this world called channelers that can tap into that. Depending on your strength in the power, you draw a certain amount in, and you weave threads of this power that allows you to make changes and stuff like that. In the Age of Legends, men and women it was much more prevalent that they had use of the power. They had much more intense powers, and they basically unearth this evil force called the Dark One, and he just like puts them into this huge war. They were in a utopia, and it's paradise lost, essentially. And so it explores the Third Age, which is thousands of years after all of society has collapsed. Everything has gone to plot, and they're basically just at medieval time, or maybe like Renaissance level technology. But it's essentially like the same world, and they have all these prophecies left over from that time where there were all these legends, and it surrounds sort of the time where that fulfillment is going, because of course at the end of the war, like this evil bad guy, the Dark One, was sealed away with his 13 worst lieutenants, and now darkness is starting to seep back into the world. It's very classic fantasy tropes in a lot of ways, but and it even starts, of course, in the very classic fantasy way. Like, you've got your Luke Skywalker-esque character, or I should say characters, because it surrounds a handful of villagers who were sort of driven out of their home for I won't spoil that, but they have to go and and sort of figure out what's going on, and these prophecies are sort of unfolding around them, and they turn into the heroes of the story. It's very obviously telegraphed that they're the heroes of the story. That's why they're, the characters you follow so much in the first chapters and whatnot.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
So this is a segment,
but
we've
it's
done
14 books long.
It is 14 books long, which is a perfect segue.
It's 14 books long. Yeah.
I'm going to do a War of Nerds. So I know Ryan and Nathan, you have not read them yet. Feel free to chime in, though, from what Brett has said. But I'm going to take the side of the defense of Wheel of Time. And Brett, you are going to require to bash on it a little bit, because we know our true opinions are kind of reversed, even though I'll give my piece afterwards as far as my true feelings. So.
Wow, okay.
I will let you take the floor and bash on it a little bit. You'll probably have less to say than I will, but
well, as I said, to be a Robert Jordan fan is to be a critic, unfortunately. I've already kind of touched on two of the biggest ones. Robert has a really, that's actually just his pen name, but he really struggled with writing women as natural characters. There are times where it does and times where it does not pass the Bechdel test. There are times where women act sort of like caricatures almost. There and to a certain degree, sometimes he does a better job from one chapter to the next, but there are times where it's just like, this character is static and never changes throughout the story. And it's in particular, it's a woman. There is kind of a funny running joke that goes with it about, the three male characters say, Rand understands women, and then Rand says, Matt understands women, why isn't he here? And then Matt's like, why isn't Perrin here? Perrin understands women, right? So there is some kind of poking fun at the not understanding women, but the primary force of wizards in there, it was at the same time revolutionary in that it was like, hey, we're going to actually center some gender type things, as this is something in here. Obviously by today's standards it's a little bit dated, but that was something that people weren't really thinking about, was that sort of thing. But oftentimes, especially the fact that this particular force of wizard women are they're political and backstabby, and it's kind of like this idea, if you thought all women are catty and bad about backstabbing one another, this taken to its logical extreme is how you would expect them to govern an entire organization. And it's just there's not a good variation in those women. That's the first really big criticism. I remember how many women I talked to, how many men I talked to, and of course I experienced it when I read Martin. I was like, I hate Cersei Lannister. She's a person, right? Mm-hmm. That's the thing. I hate her guts. And it's not even just this is a person that I don't like. It's that they weren't well fleshed out, and some of it is in the way that they're written. And as you get in there a little bit later, you kind of get an idea that the mysticism surrounding the women is very much like the wizards in D&D. They want it to look like they have no emotions, or that they're better than you are, because they want the world to think that it's an illusion of power. That's fine, but the problem is then they do it behind closed doors, and you're like, but are you just doing it? So it's really rough when you see that one. The other thing, actually, so there are three. This one's a very mild criticism that I'll go ahead and get out of the way. Especially when you read the whole series through and then you go back and read the first couple of books, there are things that happen that don't seem congruent with the way the one power is described. So there are certain things, certain activities, and certain, like if you leave out the Dark One, he has his own power set, and like him doing stuff that breaks the rules is fine because that's literally what he's doing. He's breaking everything down. So, oh great, there's gonna be a cat trying to get in here. I'm sorry, guys. So there, there are exceptions to that, but like early on, the one power has this mysticism to it, and it does things, or it's very fluid, and then later it's very rigid, right? Like it can do certain things, and it conforms to a way of doing stuff that when you go back and look at it, and it's like it doesn't seem like it's working the same way. Maybe he didn't have a perfect outline of it, or he focused so much on keeping the mysticism that he sort of diluted this specific path. Without going into spoilers or anything like that, it's hard to explain, but there is an inconsistency, especially early on. And then, of course, the final thing is he's long-winded. He says 10 words when 5 would do. He, as I've sat here and gone on and on, I realize the irony and hypocrisy of that. But I'm also not a writer. I'm a speech person, so say of that what you will. He has a lot. Like those 3 books that I said after book 9, they almost all happen concurrently. So not only is it that these things could be condensed, but they're happening at the same time. And having a 3-book expansion where almost nothing is happening because you're telling about the aftermath of what happened from 8 million different perspectives, it took it too far. There are a billion side characters, almost none of whom ever die. Like, he really needed to take a page out of Martin's book, which is kill people and make them stay dead for the most part.
And that's one of the few things I've actually heard with like having little exposure to it, is that his cast just kept growing and never shrank down in any way and became unmanageable to a certain extent. So
yeah, I mean, killing characters is good. I mean, Martin kind of got off on the path of just killing them for the sake of killing them, instead of like, oh well, I have no use for them anymore, so I'm just going to kill them off. Or maybe, I don't know, after Dan and Dave took over the last 2 seasons, which were mediocre at best compared to the rest of the earlier seasons and books of Game of Thrones. So it's just like you want to fall in love with the characters, and you want to have those emotional times where like you lose a character and it's like, man, that really hurt, like it was supposed to. But then you're like, you have a character and like, I've run out of my use for them, so we're just gonna like Miss Sunday, just gonna chop her head off for no reason other than chop her head off. So I think there's a good balance with it.
I think he does a really good job of picking of like offing not primary characters. You'll notice Ned Stark dies. Oh, spoiler! Sorry, guys. If you're watching this and you haven't either seen the first season of Game of Thrones or read the first book, you're probably in the wrong place anyway. But Ned Stark, he seems to be poised as a pivotal character, and he dies. That actually is not without purpose. It's perfectly with purpose. It sets the tone for his book series, which is no one is unexpendable, right?
Yep.
You've spent this time with a character with perspective. He's often people here and there, not necessarily left and right, but people are dying, and it just happens in the story. And then a main character dies, and you get this sense of like, anyone could go. Anyone could go. There's nothing sacred. In some ways, that's really good. I don't think that would have worked for Jordan because he's telling a very different kind of story. So I'm not necessarily advocating for that. But there are about 8 million side characters who never die. And I do feel like one of the things that even killing off side characters, especially if you do a little bit to kind of build those side characters somewhat, is offer stakes. You may know that your that your favorite main protagonist is not about to die, before the ending of the story, but so and so over here who you kind of started to like, if he gets offed, you're like, oh man, I better not get too attached to these NPCs, roughly,
So that brings me to why I think that Wheel of Time, despite those drawbacks, is absolutely a great story to get into. Whether you're an expert fantasy reader or a novice just starting to dab your feet into it. His world is absolutely unique in the sense that when you open up a fantasy book, you want to feel like you're entering a world you haven't experienced before. And I think his creature creation, I think that his, well, yes, he relies on the same tropes that many fantasy books do. They're the tropes everybody loves to look for. The reluctant character, the reluctant hero, and you actually get several of them. You get the uh, in this case, as you mentioned, Brett, female wizard who comes and brings you out of this mundane life and teaches you about the magic that you're experiencing. His twist on that is unique in that I don't think it's been done before or since, in that magic is not necessarily good for all people, and the negativity surrounding that is unique. The side characters that he brings in, that he's almost got three categories. He's got side characters that don't ever play a big role, then you've got side characters that are important, and then you've got main characters. And the side characters that become important, I think you fall in love with. They're interesting. They're fun to kind of talk with. I'm thinking of the giant. They're gonna hate.
Loyal.
Fans are gonna hate me. Yes, his
Well,
philosophical idea, his even though he talks super slow and has to explain himself in long-windedness because he's in a much longer lifespan than humans are. His that I associated with myself so much, mainly because I have a degree in philosophy, and the philosophizing that he does, or the whatever. It was super interesting. Yes, philosophizing. Thank you. Was interesting for me. Then you have the cyclical nature of the Wheel of Time. His writing in general, even though it can be long-winded, it's not as flowery as some authors, but it's definitely enjoyable to read. And if you read it aloud, it's also fun. His word choice is interesting. It's enjoyable. And again, the long-windedness when he says 10 words to say 5, that could get in the way. But again, he's got times where he's describing things and you're like, this is interesting, even though I want to get back to the main story. This has got some merit to it. What I'll also say is, and this is maybe not as viewed for modern authors as it is for someone like Tolkien, but Robert Jordan defined fantasy, epic fantasy, after Tolkien. I don't think you can really point to anybody that bridges the gap necessarily. So you've got Tolkien, and then there's an era where there's a lot of myths. Like C.S. Lewis kind of is at the same time as Tolkien. But Tolkien is the godfather, the grandfather, the patriarch of modern fantasy. And then after that, you have Jordan. Like there's no one else that really fits the mold. And then you have Martin, but they tell two different style of stories. So like the hero, the light side of fantasy, the hero, sword and board, magic, good versus evil, that's Jordan. And no one has knocked him off that pedestal until maybe Brandon Sanderson, but he even has that gateway where I finished the Wheel of Time. So he kind of is the heir apparent in that regard. And I think time will tell whether he actually holds that mantle or if someone else takes it up. So I think that's something you can't really look past when you look at an author. And if they've got such clout behind them, give them a try because it's probably worth it.
Yeah. Well, and he does have some sci-fi elements that he alludes to. I think at one point he might have written some science fiction. I remember reading somewhere that when he goes into the Age of Legends, he sort of touches back on his sci-fi roots, and I was kind of like, record scratch. What are we talking about here? Because I've never read those. And I agree with you. Like, I had not heard of a lot of folks talking about other fantasy. I mean, you got like Conan the Barbarian, which I think technically qualifies as like a very low magic fantasy, but it's still in that it's still in that realm, that wheelhouse. But yeah, it kind of filled a niche, and apart from like, I mean, there were a lot, like I think Salvatore wrote his Drizzt books before, maybe not before the first book, but around the same time. So like you had the D&D fictions and stuff like that, but they're just like leagues apart in terms of what they're aiming for.
And see, for me, I think the main thing, and we've talked about this elsewhere, but the women characters within Jordan, I think, pull me back a lot from the story. So full disclosure, I've only gotten to book 4. I haven't finished book 4. I know Brett is like, that's the book where it gets going. Like, you've got to finish
the book where it gets going. Yes. I'm surprised that you've been so slow on book 4, but yeah.
But that's where I'm at. But I can admire the fact that someone like Jordan has written what he's written, and I love the characters as I'm reading the book. But even the male characters, I feel, are slow to develop, and that could just be because modern fantasy has characters developing rapidly. Like, you see progress, and every time I start a new book, kind of spoilers, so they kind of revert, in my opinion. Like, you have this grand epiphany, and then you're starting back at square one so they can have another grand epiphany, which you could probably argue is real life in a sense.
Yeah, I mean, so a character's going to be grounded, but like a character does need to change. They've got to have some kind of real growth, even if that even if that growth is not huge, right? It does not have to, like, it doesn't have to be Luke Skywalker blowing up the Death Star level of change from, you know, I mean, even that is really like when he goes to meet Master Yoda, he has that humbling moment where it's like, you know, everything that you've gone after is not what you need to become. And so, you know, like there is your reset. You take the same character and they meet something, the conflict that they can't just be exactly the same. And it brings them not necessarily back to square one, but it's like, look at all you've accomplished. Nope, no, you haven't. This is what you really need to know to become a human being, and you're building blocks with that. That absolutely gets better as the series goes on. There are certain characters there are certain characters that kind of stay static. Sometimes it's good and sometimes it's bad. Because the character, like, one of the best examples, I'm not going to spoil it, but one of the best examples is a character that the whole time he maintains the same demeanor, the same like personality, outlook, and everything. But what happens is you're seeing who he really is the whole time, right? Like, it's not that he doesn't ever change throughout the story, but what you thought of him at the beginning of the story is completely different from what you realize of him by the end of the story. And so it's not that, like, you don't see the same character growth as other people where it's like they're changing this whole time. It's like, no, he's been this different person all along, but everybody in the story is just kind of misattributed. So that's I mean, that's a really masterful thing that he does. Agreed. It's a very, very good thing. Yes, book 4 is where it gets going good. If you could just like get through that, it's so good. It's tough. I mean, it's tough when you have a series that's like that to say. Well, I mean, one of my favorite series on television is Avatar: The Last Airbender. Getting through the first season can be painful. Like, I get it. If somebody's like, I'm not really into it, I'm like, stick with it. It seems like it's not worth your time until you hit season 2, right? That one's an even bigger one. 4 900-page books. Yeah, stick through the 4th one. I promise you, you know, if you really enjoy fantasy, you'll get to a point where you're like, oh, this is insane. I can't believe this. And it gets you hooked. It's bad that's the best book, but like, I never, like, after that, it's not one of those that I'm like, well, it jumped the shark and everything sucks from there on. The next 2-3 books are pretty darn good. There are some low points for sure, but it never, like, it's just that it doesn't quite meet that level of awesomeness, but It's also a really enjoyable experience overall. I will admit I have read through the series a couple times, and that represents a monumentally large amount of time. The last few times for book 10, 11, I think it's 10, 11, and 12, I think it's 10, 11, and 12, or maybe it's 10 and 12, 10, 11. I have just gotten like a chapter by chapter, no descriptions type thing that I read through to see what happens again, because it's so long, and it's like, I just need to get through this part right here and get it going until we hit Sanderson's books.
So that brings me to a question we've kind of done on this podcast before. Like, by the time people watch this episode, they'll have seen it with, I don't know if it was a different interview or if it was in our Game of Thrones episode, but we talked about who would take over Game of Thrones if he doesn't finish that series. So I'll open this up to anybody who has an idea, but what author could finish that series the way Brandon Sanderson has finished this one? And you talked about Conan the Barbarian. There have been countless people to step into that role and write new novels, new visual novels, and take that in different directions, but all stay within the true nature of it. So whoever would like to start, but if we have kind of a concept on that.
Yeah, Nathan, you want to start?
Can't remember what I said in that episode. I think I'd either said Brandon Sanderson or a Peter Jackson type. Like if it was going to get turned into a movie or something, like Peter Jackson is one of the most, one of the best directors when it comes to turning books into movies. Just because he focuses so much on the lore and making sure that it's so accurate to the written word of the story and the characters.
We're specifically talking about Game of Thrones now, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah, we're talking about Game of Thrones.
Gotcha.
We tend to tangent a lot.
No, that's good. I like that.
As for authors like Brandon Sanderson, he's like a lot of those other authors who are extremely worthy, like Stephen King, Timothy Zahn. They put a lot of extra words in there for descriptive measures and things like that. Well, for Game of Thrones, Martin is a wordy author. He puts a lot of descriptiveness in his stuff, and he has a very elegant way of doing that with a lot of things. But it also gets to the point where you're just kind of like, okay, we already know about this because we've been to this point before in the books. Can we move on and actually get to something else? And something else we also talked about with Martin was how you go the first 3 books and then all of a sudden, we're just going to forget about Tyrion, Jon Snow, Daenerys, and we're going to switch to some other character POVs and forget about the people that we spent so much time with the first 3 books. And so it's like, if we could have an author who could emulate a perfect balance to finish the series, because I don't know if Martin's going to finish it or not. Honestly, I think he'll probably.
I felt like Martin cut a better balance in book 5 with that. Book 4 was a really big departure from, like you say, it was a whole lot of new. And what's bad is I really like the Martells, so but like that book, I loved the Martells, and yet that is also my least favorite book. So I heard a joke, which was Patrick Rothfuss tapped to not finish Game of Thrones if in the event that that he dies. But you know what? I'm gonna throw this out there. I think he would actually be a good choice for that. Not, all jokes aside about how he wouldn't be able to finish it, and it would just be like we'd all be skeletons by the time that happens. Bear that in mind. They have a very similar writing style. They do characters in a similar, like, he really knows how to get into a character's mindset and do something with that character. I know he's read the books because he's talked about it as an inspiration and things like that. I know how different AJ, well, I don't know if you guys have read any of the Patrick Rothfuss books, but specifically the spin-offs, A Slow Regard for Silent Things, and his little thing from the Rogues book, which was another side character. Not only is the character's perspective very different, and like he's writing for a different character very well, I would almost say that the narrative style is even kind of different from what you see in the other books. So he gets so immersed in those characters that he does a good job of almost changing the way that he writes. There's my dogs trying to get in through the window. Great. And so I'm actually gonna. So I read an interview where Brandon Sanderson was asked this exact question, and he said, "I really enjoy George R.R. Martin's books, but because of the way that he writes and the way that I write, I could not finish this." And yeah, I think he's,
like I tried writing grimdark when it was really the hot thing and everybody was doing it, and it sucked. So I agree with you there. I don't know if Brandon Sanderson's style fits it, but I think a lot of people would point to him because he's done it already, and he is
because he's done it already. Yeah. Well, and that's the thing, is he is so prolific and so capable of doing it. I can understand why Nathan is thinking, oh yeah, he could finish it out because he's good at just churning out these books and things like that. But and being, verbose about it too. But I think he's, he's going to know what his style is in that case. And I agree with him. Like, the grimmest thing he's written so far is Mistborn. It's definitely not like anywhere near as first of all, there's the lack of profanity, the lack of sexual innuendo. It's very sterile, and that comes from his religious background. The show for Wheel of Time is a little bit more like they wanted to HBO-ize it. They wanted it to be more Game of Thrones, and a lot of my friends pointed out Jordan was always very tactful and graceful about keeping it to where it was, for even though it was so long and long-winded and everything, there wasn't anybody who was going to be offended by the language or sexual innuendo. He always left it up to implication very tastefully, did a good job. It was never sterile, but it was also not really discussed too heavily. And I think he kind of does the same thing, whereas Martin is the only writer that I've ever read that made me sick to my stomach. Like the way that he talks about gore and stuff like that, like when he talks about a knight braining somebody, I remember having to put my book down at one point and just be mildly sick to my stomach about that description. It was so visceral and graphic. It's good writing, it's great. It was just a bit much, and I don't think it falls in the style of somebody who's known for super clean writing. I think it needs, I'm not even sure, I think Rothfuss is the one that comes to mind, but none of his stuff is particularly gory or visceral either. I've not read a whole lot else that is. So that part might be a little bit tougher, but there are others who are no stranger to sexual innuendo, definitely no stranger to obscenity, that sort of thing. It doesn't seem like that should be that big of a...
Yeah, it shouldn't be, and I'm with you there, because I think Martin has a very unique style outside of anybody else, where he doesn't have many tropes that other fantasy authors dive into, that he kind of subverts a lot of them. He's really great at history. He's really great at individual characters. And I've only read one book by him, but I know he's a very popular author in that vein, is Joe Abercrombie. But I don't even know if he's got the gore, he's got the history, he's got the war. I've only read the one book. He did really well with the characters, so maybe he could do something. I
read 3 of his books, and I think that was probably that might be definitely more inspired than Rothfuss, because Joe Abercrombie is the one that I was I put the book down and I was like, that is the most depressing thing I have ever read in my entire life, right? It's like, wow, this is so bleak. And he was just like, everything that you thought about fantasy is wrong. Mark it down. Like, it's just this very cynical view, especially of money. Like, it's just very like, if you're a fan of money, I hate you. You're the problem with the world. It's kind of like, just like, great. So glad that that we spent that time. It's like, this is this magical world and everything. None of it matters. Money's the only thing that matters. And it's like, ew. So, but yeah,
What
like,
about you, Ryan?
I think to tap somebody like,
go Brett.
No, I was just guys tapping somebody like that who has a good understanding of the history, the bleakness, and isn't afraid to that's what I wanted to say before. It shouldn't matter necessarily, but if someone is uncomfortable writing that, they're probably not going to do a good job with what they're uncomfortable with.
Yeah, I agree.
I think that's a very good point. I do think spot on with what you guys were talking about with Brandon Sanderson. He's completed somebody else's work. He stepped into that role before, so I think his name does often come back up a lot. And I know he's talked about not being able to write that style. I do think he's a little bit of an amoeba where he wouldn't be comfortable, but being tasked with it, I think he has the skill and the ability to do it. Obviously, we've seen it done poorly with the continuation in the show of them just trying to do it on their own. But I mean, I just say give it to Alfred and Nathan, let them co-write it, and there's their spark into their career, and then we take it from there. So
I'm good with that.
Nice plug. Yeah, nice plug. I like it.
But I don't know if we want to switch into D&D, talk about that a little bit before we wrap up, since I know that's kind of how you guys got together.
So I have a question, and tell me if is it possible to pause for just a minute, because I've got my dog screaming at the window here.
I'll edit this stuff out in the middle. But
thank you. I appreciate that.
No worries.
They always demand attention.
Yes, they do.
Mm-hmm.
All right, we can just count in, and then Alfred, if you want to talk a little bit about being brought into it, and then we can just go a little bit into D&D before we wrap up.
Sounds good to me.
Sounds good.
You can count yourself in if you want.
So, Brett, we actually met when we were working at a restaurant together, and you were like, hey, do you play any D&D? Or it actually started with Rothfuss, and then you were like, have you played D&D? And I was like, I've always wanted to. And you were like, kind of grabbed me and took me away to your house and chained me to a chair and taught me. No. But you did say, hey, please come over. I'm starting a D&D game. Would you like to be a part of it? And I cut my teeth on 5e, and it was an amazing experience. We talk about probably every fifth session that we had in that campaign, from grand battles that were game breaking and required some quick thinking on the DM's part, or
some very slow thinking on my part. Sometimes I would have to actually go like that. I remember a few times having to go, okay, give me 10 minutes. So I would just go into a completely different room and be like, grab the mirror and be like, you've got to do this, figure something out. Yeah, for real.
But it was
I'll take I want to take a minute. So Dungeons and Dragons has been in my life for a really long time. When I mentioned before about my brother who worked for WotC for a while, how he used to, he would make his own games, but he also forced me lovingly to play Dungeons and Dragons. And so I had a handful of characters in second edition. When third edition came out, my brother was just like, this came out, read this, you're going to make a character and we're going to play it together sometime, right? So and I just gobbled it up, right? This was even to a certain degree before I had read Wheel of Time. So D&D is even more near and dear to me in that regard. I've played every edition since second. and it was at the tail end of second edition, but I played 2 or 3 characters there badly because I was in like, 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th grade, that kind of thing. Third edition came out when I was in 9th grade. I didn't have a ton of play with that one, but we played Dungeons and Dragons and the Star Wars D20 system. We played a little bit of the old D6 system, but I've been a huge fan of D&D for a long time. One of the main reasons why I dragged AJ back into it was it had been 5 or 6 years since I had actually gotten to really play a significant amount of D&D. And 4th edition was fine. Not great. but like I also didn't have a regular group of people to play 4th. So in addition to the difficulties of running it and the complications, I enjoyed it just fine, but I didn't have a regular group. In 3.5, I had a regular group with my brother and his friends in college, and I made some really great characters, had some great campaigns. That was my, like, getting back into it just a few years ago with 5th edition. That sent me to a different level, and I even got to where I enjoyed DMing more than I enjoy playing characters, although, as AJ can probably tell you, I also really enjoy playing characters. What I'm trying to say is, if I could play D&D a lot, like, I've burnt my friends out on D&D for a time because of my obsession with it. So if you want me to be on the cons list for D&D, that's going to be really hard, except for the fact that I can say it's incredibly addictive. And if you don't want to get hooked on something like this, don't get involved in D&D.
Yeah. And it's not just the
That's
game
all
itself.
that I can.
You got dice that's addicting, games that are addicting, books that are addicting.
Yeah. There's so much to add to it. Yeah,
it's cool that you said you started in 2nd edition, because that's where I started too. And I know I mentioned this, we talked about a D&D episode in the last season. Do you remember, and I hope I'm remembering this right, but in 2nd edition there was like a brawlers table in the back of the book?
Oh gosh.
Where do you recall that at all?
So I would say that, like, I was so young, and I'm ADHD as hell. I'm just so very like, being able to attend to things and stay on topic is not my forte, unless I hyper focus. And like, I really enjoyed it, but my brother had all the AD&D books until I got them secondhand, which was after 3rd edition. And by that point I was like, let me memorize this book instead, right? So I probably wouldn't be the best person to ask for that. I did go back and play it once when I was in college. It went very badly. I ended up as a like an 8 Constitution, 1 HP rogue, and it was like I died in the first battle. No take back seas. It was one of those kind of like, we're gonna do a fun thing about just how bad was it playing D&D, and I got the full experience. I think I mean, it sounds about right, but I wouldn't be able to. I wouldn't be the best one to verify that.
I need to look it up, but I've talked about this the second time, but it was like a cool thing if you were at a bar and you were just in a fight, instead of going like, this player is like level 20 and this is a peasant, you would just be equal health and you would roll for the attack, and then that attack would be whatever move you did, which would have a damage assigned to it. And it was a way to have like a bar fight with scaling those 2 people to the same level. But I started in 2nd edition. I went to 3rd edition. I completely skipped 4th edition because I tried it and I couldn't stand it. And I have yet to play past like one day of 5th edition, which irks me to all belief, because finding a group to play with has been impossible locally for me. But I want to so badly get into 5th edition. So.
Yeah, I sympathize with you. One of the guys that you brought on here earlier, Matt, he plays with us, and he always likes to tell me that 3.5 is the best edition of all, and he loves to do that to burn me up. But that's because I played so much of 3rd edition, and I saw like the min-maxing, and I saw, like, sometimes we could have some fun little things, but I saw how out of control the min-maxing could get. I mean,
And I really like the skills and feats from third edition. I know that's a little bit into the min max and like really powering your character with that stuff, but I did enjoy like going down those roads. And then I know 3.5 had like probably 20 plus books of like extra classes you could go down and cross classes.
Yeah.
So I really like, that's where I played a bulk of my D&D was in third edition and going into 3.5. So I definitely can understand that. But just everything they've done with fifth edition, they've cleaned it up, they've streamlined it, they've made it accessible.
That's exactly what I like about fifth edition. Fifth edition, for all of its faults, like it, you know, especially when it first launched, it kind of had a dearth of content in terms of the character classes that you're going to play. 3.5 had so much bloat by the end of it, and they never did anything to really restrict it. It was just like, let's see how many more things we can shove out the window. You know, just throw whatever out you can to get as much content on the floor. From a marketing perspective, well, actually, let's come back to that. But like, you would think that'd be a great money-making strategy to just shove as much content out as you can at once. It didn't actually work that well for them. This time they slow rolled it, and they might have even gone a little bit too conservative with it. I could see that argument, but I loved the fact that fifth edition followed some decent guidelines and some like boundaries, reasonable boundaries for character class creation or subclass creation, for even like bounded accuracy itself creating. I remember how it'd be like, oh, I'm 12th level, so you could throw 1,000,000 kobolds at me and I'd never die if I had the right build. Like, and in fact, I literally had a character. I was one of those people. I was the bad guy. It's me. Hi, I'm the problem. It's me. I had a character that was like, I can stand in a doorway and literally never be killed by just 1,000,000 of these mooks coming at me at one point. And that's what I did. It was like, y'all take a long rest. My character doesn't need to sleep. My character isn't being hit by these guys. Except for a nat 20, and I can heal myself, so we're all good, right? Like, it was bad. When fifth edition came out, it cleared out a lot of that bloat. It did a really great job with that. Can you go quite as insane? Not as much, but I actually do think that there's something good. And you know, really, a creative DM can just be like, I'm going to waive the rule that says you can only have 3 magic items attuned to you, or you know, they might give you a whole bunch of little consumables, which is what I did, right? I gave AJ's character 1,000,000 consumables, and that ended up being a fun way to kind of supplement it. So you can get around some of those things. Fifth edition, it's hard for me to go back to any other edition. Does it have flaws? Absolutely. Every edition's going to. I mean, D&D in general has its own flaws. We don't just play D&D. We've been playing some other games and things like that. And that's I think the best way to vary your experience, find the best form of D&D you can. And then when you're trying to do something that's not D&D, don't play D&D. Right?
Yeah. Do either of you guys remember when 4th edition came out?
I do.
I want to say I was in high school, but it might have been college actually, but
so you played second edition. Well, I mean, do we have a problem with talking about our ages on here?
No, I'm 36 and I played second edition, which was my friend's books when I was like in 5th, 6th grade.
Gotcha.
So like
okay, so I'm 39. I'm only a couple years older than you. I played that. So third edition came out when I was in 9th grade, which would have been for you, right, when you were getting those books. And I was just out of college, so I was about 22, which would be somewhere around 06, 07, 08, somewhere in there is when 4th edition actually came out.
And I was going into college that year, actually.
Okay,
so I think, yeah.
All right, so that makes sense. Yeah, and it's kind of what is kind of murky. So my brother did the Star Wars Saga edition. And at the end of 3.5, they did Book of Nine Swords.
Yeah.
That book was cracked, absolutely cracked, and it was all a prelude to D&D 4th edition, which kind of solved the problem. I don't know if you guys have run into it, but like in the earlier things, it was like fighters, barbarians, and everybody else who's a non-caster type person. Once you hit a certain level, they just stop being relevant because the other characters are throwing around godlike powers that are just, and to a certain degree, 5th edition even still has that. I think it's still much tighter than 3rd edition ever got. Book of Nine Swords did throw that out of whack. That's actually how I got said character standing in the doorway and killing a million kobolds trying to come at me at a time. But like those, so there was like this period of about 2 years as they were playtesting it that was sort of all leading into that. So you had this weird amalgamation towards the end where products really reflected that. I like the and I know it sounds biased to say that I like my brother's product, but I did actually really like the Saga edition of Star Wars. It just like it suffered from, in the same vein, it was an attempt to be like, we're going to insert these powers which reset, and certain different groups are going to get it, but then the ones that didn't, it was like that missing really made those classes and things struggle. Of course, in a world like Star Wars, not playing a Jedi, you're already nerfing yourself in most cases. But
see, that's interesting too, because with 5e, and it may just be because that's where I started, but you see so much homebrew stuff on the internet, and I was trying to see like if 4th edition came out before the internet or when the internet wasn't as big, but the internet was in full swing by 2006, 2008. So I just don't think there was as much of it, or maybe because D&D hadn't exploded as it is now, in the making it so streamlined that so many more people can access it. So I wonder that stuff
5th edition
now
hit at the right time.
Yeah.
5th edition hit at the right time because there was Stranger Things coming around the same time. Critical Role came out right around the beginning of 5th edition. And that took off in popularity and even got some real mainstream. So what kind of happened, and I'm sure you probably experienced some of this if you were playing it, Ryan. Nathan, did you play Dungeons and Dragons at all, or?
I have not, no.
Okay, all right. So, growing up, liking Star Wars and Wheel of Time and Dungeons and Dragons it was not the thing that people were like, oh, okay, sure. It was the thing that got you beaten up and stuffed in your locker for. It was the thing that you hid. And so like around that time this came out, it was a really great iteration. It was very accessible. There weren't too many supplements, and it came out at a time where it flipped the script. The nerds who played Dungeons and Dragons in their closets or their basements, hiding it from the world, started making movies and making video games and stuff like that, and it started picking up more acceptability. And then once it flipped even further in that it became almost a mainstream thing. And so 5th edition's success is largely because, instead of being portrayed as these are worthless losers stuck in their mom's basement who haven't showered, it was just like, do you remember back when we were kids and we did X, how fun that was, right? It wasn't this negatively stigmatized experience. It was, I am even still, I remember the remnants of the Satanic Panic, right? Like my mom, we had magic cards and my brother hid all the black deck from my mom to be like, here's all the angelics. See, this isn't an evil satanic game or whatever, right? Because he knew what that would be perceived as, because our mom would have flipped out. So, there was moral panic, there was the stigma of being a nerd, all of that was just gone. And then you also have a suddenly much more comprehensible and accessible version of the game that was a huge thing. Do I think that this is perfect for 5th edition because 5th edition deserved it? Absolutely, I do. I love 5th edition better than all of the rest of them. It did so well because the stars aligned in such a way that it would be a commercial success, as well as, you know, being seen by the already nerd community as, you know, this is a really good, clean version of the same thing. There had also been so much controversy with previous editions. This one was like, we're getting back to our roots. We want you to see the old nostalgia of it, but we also want it to be a clean, reasonable game. They really worked their butts off to make sure it was the kind of product that they could ship away. We don't see lately we don't see a lot of labor of love. A lot of, it's funny. We've gotten Game of the Year, which was Larian's Baldur's Gate 3. That was based off of 5th edition. It did some big changes and stuff, but a lot of the time people are like, this is a game that they sort of half did the job on, and they just threw it out half finished, and they were like, well, we'll fix the bugs along the way, just pay us more money, right?
Yeah.
With this version of D&D, it was successful because they took the time, they completed it, they play tested it, they did what they needed to do to make it a success, then launched it. And it, again, right timing and everything, but it's not one that I look back on and I'm like, wow. And again, yes, I know I sound biased because my brother worked on it, I get that, but like, part of that is I hear what he's told me. I hear, we got to do X, right? With this other one, we were being told you need to make it more like a war game, a strategy game with 4th edition, right? And they gave this this demand from up on high that you had to do it to sell more minis, or to make it more like, this is the part of the game where everybody likes, make the rest of the game like that. Here they were sort of like, this isn't working, it's not fun for us to make, we're going to make it the way we want to, and we're going to focus on making it fun and making it work.
I think
it's hard to do.
It really is hard to do, but I think it's a wonderful addition. If you haven't played D&D yet, absolutely go to your local store. They're everywhere now. You can find them at Walmart. Pick up a copy of the Player's Handbook and the DMG, Dungeon Master Guide. Find some friends and build your stories. And then get a whole bunch of dice too.
Yeah, the dice goblin over here has to put in the shameless plug for the 8 million types of dice that he's supporting. But yeah,
indeed. And I think that's a good note to hit the wrap on as well.
I think so.
Agreed.
Thank you so much for
Ryan,
being here.
Alfred, you got anything else?
No, I'm good.
Thanks for having me, guys.
Absolutely. Thank you for coming on. Everybody have a good
To all
night.
of our wonderful, to all of our funky listeners out there, as always, we're your bearded nerdy hosts. Make sure to hit that like, subscribe, and share with all of your friends and campaigns and everything to infinity and beyond. And we'll see you on the next one.
Ooh.